Exodus chapter 1, verse 8 through Exodus chapter 2, verse 10. Exodus chapter 1, verse 8 through chapter 2, verse 10. Hear the word of the Lord. Now over Egypt arises a new king who does not know Joseph. He says to his people, "Look, the Israelite people are more numerous and more powerful than we. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, or they increase and in the event of war, join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land." Therefore they set taskmasters over them to oppress them with forced labors. They build supply cities, Pithom and Ramses for Pharaoh. But the more they are oppressed, the more they multiply and spread, so that the Egyptians come to dread the Israelites. The Egyptians become ruthless in imposing tasks on the Israelites, and make their lives bitter with hard service in mortar and brick, and in every kind of field labor. They are ruthless in all the tasks they impose upon them. The king of Egypt says to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom is named Shiphrah and the other Puah, "When you act as midwives to the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool, if it is a boy, kill him. But if it is a girl, she lives." But the midwives fear God, and they do not do as the king of Egypt commands them, but they let the boys live. So the king of Egypt summons the midwives and says to them, "Why do you do this, and allow the boys to live?" The midwives say to Pharaoh, "Because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife comes to them." So God deals well with the midwives, and the people multiply and become very strong. And because the midwives fear God, he gives them families. Then Pharaoh commands all his people, "Every boy that is born to the Hebrews, throw into the Nile, but let every girl live." Now a man from the house of Levi goes and marries a Levite woman. The woman conceives and bears a son, and when she sees that he is a fine baby, she hides him 3 months. When she can hide him no longer, she gets a papyrus basket for him and plasters it with bitumen and pitch. She puts the child in it and places it among the reeds on the bank of the river. His sister stands at a distance to see what happens to him. The daughter of Pharaoh comes down to bathe at the river, while her attendants walk beside the river. She sees the basket among the reeds and sends her maids to bring it. When she opens it, she sees the child. He is crying, and she takes pity on him. "This must be one of the Hebrews' children," she says. Then his sister says to Pharaoh's daughter, "Do I go and get you a nurse from the Hebrew women to nurse the child for you?" Pharaoh's daughter says to her, "Yes." So the girl goes and calls the child's mother. Pharaoh's daughter says to her, "Take this child and nurse it for me, and I give you your wages." So the woman takes the child and nurses it. When the child grows up, she brings him to Pharaoh's daughter, and she takes him as her son. She names him Moses, because, she says, "I draw him out of the water." Word of God for the people of God.
Thanks be to God.
Fight or flight is a very normal reaction to the unknown. Generally, it is spontaneous. It's not a thought-out response. We can train ourselves not to respond reactively, following predetermined procedures instead. That is at the root of how military forces train soldiers to set aside gut responses and trust their training instead. We have the ability to respond to the world around us in much more creative ways than succumbing to instinctual reactions. All too often, however, we allow our fears and oppression to direct us, even when the danger is simply one that we have imagined. How do we move beyond fear and oppression into the life that God has for us? Around age 13, I was alone walking around outside my uncle's house. As I turned around and was nearing the back of the house, I saw a snake on the roof. It seemed agitated, moving its upper body back and forth, its tongue darting in and out. I wasn't sure what to make of it. I had not really encountered many snakes in my life. This actually may have been the first one that I had seen in the wild. I didn't stick around for a scientific investigation. I took off running. The 150 yards to my grandparents' house, I ran the whole way till I got to the gate, though the snake was very far behind by that time. It probably moved on in some different route by then. I wasn't thinking. I reacted. Reaction took me a good distance away from what I perceived as a threat. Today's passage describes a new Pharaoh coming to power in Egypt. This is likely a new dynasty. Egypt being taken over by a new people. This Pharaoh had no familiarity with Joseph's story, how these Hebrews had come to Egypt, or what role they had played in Egypt's past. This new Pharaoh was focused on consolidating his power. He imagined these Hebrews as a threat in the making. The argument he sets forth is contradictory from the beginning. But that did not seem to matter. First of all, the Hebrews have become a threat due to being too numerous. That they would assist an enemy of Egypt to attack would appear a strange notion. If they were already too numerous for Egypt, they were already too much of a threat in numbers, why wait for some enemy to come along? That they would escape from the land would appear to be a strange concern, unless they had already been pressed into service to Pharaoh. The king resolved to oppress them, to bring them further under his control. He supposedly desired to curb the possibility of their becoming a threat, whether direct or indirect. It would appear this was also more of a scare tactic. He was attempting to foment ill will toward the Hebrews. He hoped to thereby increase his power and control over Egypt. He hoped that this would make him that much greater and more secure. The proposed oppression went forward. It did not accomplish what he had set out to accomplish. It did not make him or the rest of Egypt feel more secure. The Hebrew population kept growing. So Pharaoh returned to the very same strategy as before, determined that greater oppression was needed, that would then curb this threat. That still did not seem to accomplish what he wanted. Next, Pharaoh ordered the midwives to kill all the male Hebrew so as to lessen their strength for fighting. The midwives did not follow through. The Hebrews' numbers continued to increase. So Pharaoh then orders the whole nation to participate in killing all the male Hebrew children, throwing them into the Nile. This would give the nation a common enemy and a common purpose. The number of Hebrews continued to increase. Even one of Pharaoh's daughters defied Pharaoh's order. She encountered a male Hebrew child hidden in a basket of reeds at the edge of the river as she went out to bathe. She took him as her own, intending to bring him directly into Pharaoh's house. Moses' sister came out of hiding to intervene. The story makes it sound like the princess might have been tricked by Moses' sister, who had been watching over him. She approached the princess, offering to find her a wet nurse from among the Hebrews to feed the child. It was a rather feebly veiled ruse to take Moses back to his own mother until he was weaned. Before being given back into the prince's care, the princess agreed to the plan. Not only was Moses reunited with his mother, he was granted a protected status, and his mother was provided a stipend to nurse her own child. The princess was in no way fooled. She simply went along with the story in her desire to keep the child for her own. She did not want to participate in the charge to drown male Hebrew children. Now, Pharaoh's attempt to oppress the Hebrews did not quite go according to plan. Sure, they were oppressed. Sure, life continued to grow harder for them. The problem was the Hebrews continued multiplying, and even his own household participated in working against this inhumane ploy to cling to and consolidate power, whatever the cost. Pharaoh's problem continued unabated. These strategies did not allay Pharaoh's fears. The cruelty would continue, but it would not result in a more submissive workforce. It would not guarantee keeping the Hebrews under Egypt's thumb. Ruling and passing policies out of fear simply cannot guarantee the outcome that Pharaoh had in mind. The root of his fear, the root of his insecurity, was never addressed. Pharaoh was simply reacting. Pharaoh was giving little thought to the long-term effects of his actions. His fear led to oppression, but not to any resolution. Remember, you were strangers in Egypt. This would become a refrain in the Hebrew Scriptures, calling the people to remember what it was like to live under oppression. As they left Egyptian bondage and interacted with immigrant groups in their own midst, they were to rise above this example that they had experienced of oppression. It called them to do better, to be better than Pharaoh. It was also a reminder that oppression did not work out very well for Egypt in the long term. It was a reminder that God hears the cry of the oppressed, that God responds with grace and redemption, that God does not take the side of oppressors, but the side of the oppressed. Egypt had the opportunity to become an even greater world power than it already was. Pharaoh did not choose to deal appropriately or wisely with the minority populations under his influence and control. Not even all the Egyptians went along with his policy of oppression as a tool to overcome his fears. One can stir up a population by stoking and preying on their fears. For a time, that may seem to have an effect. Yet this power strategy requires constant fueling. If you take away one population that has been blamed for one's circumstances, and yet the circumstances remain, you need increasing oppression and new enemies to blame to demonstrate that you're doing more and are still in control. Without addressing the underlying issues, however, one's true needs will never be resolved. It doesn't matter how much angst we can stir up. It doesn't matter how much violence we can throw at a problem. If the underlying fears are never acknowledged or never addressed. One might increase in power, but it's at the expense of any real solution. The fears remain. Violence does not resolve our insecurities. It simply hides them temporarily. I've learned to look upon snake encounters with a much calmer eye over the years. My heart no longer accelerates to send me running off in the other direction. I pause to discern what category of snake it is, whether it is actually being aggressive, and whether it actually presents a danger to me or to others. Since that time, I've encountered numerous snakes. Some I have held, petted, shown to my children. When copperheads were after our chickens, I killed them. The first time was the only time I ever ran away from one. We don't have to live our lives out of fear. They don't do a good job of directing our lives. How do we address our fears, or those stoking our fears, to expand their power? Do we address our insecurities head on? Isn't that where we should be looking more directly? If God is indeed with us, beside us, and nothing in all of creation can separate us from the love of God in Jesus Christ, why would we fear? Would you join me for our closing hymn?